This is a story about a promise made in the dark, a debt paid in blood and grit, and the hard-won truth that the only thing more dangerous than the frontier is the man who tries to tame it. The rock behind Cain's head exploded into a spray of granite dust and whining lead. He hugged the narrow ledge, the weight of the child strapped to his chest, a fragile, warm burden. Below, in the moon-bleached canyon, 3 of Corcoran's riders were reloading, their silhouettes stark against the pale sand. Another 50 yards back, pinned down behind a cluster of salt cedars, was the woman, Elara, with the other infant. Her return fire was sporadic, a single, carefully aimed shot from a pistol that looked too big for her hand. She was conserving ammunition. Good. They had 12 rounds between them, a half-full canteen, and 100 miles of badlands to cross before the nearest friendly settlement. The odds were long. Cain didn't care about the odds. He cared about the debt. He shifted, peering around the rock. The riders were fanning out, trying to get a crossfire. He needed to move, to draw their attention away from Elara. He looked over at her, a fleeting shadow in the deeper shadows of the trees. He couldn't call out, but their plan was already set, a desperate strategy forged in whispers while on the run. He gave a sharp, 2-note whistle, the call of a canyon wren. It was their signal. I move, you cover. Answering gunfire cracked from her position, kicking up sand near the leftmost rider. It was all the diversion he would get. Cain scrambled from the ledge, his boots finding purchase on the crumbling scree. He ran low, the sleeping infant a precious, vulnerable weight against his ribs. Another rifle shot thundered through the canyon, a bullet tugging at the sleeve of his duster. He didn't slow. He reached a deeper fissure in the canyon wall, a black slash of shadow that offered better cover, and slid into it, his back slamming against the cold stone. He gasped for breath, the alkaline air burning his lungs. He checked the child on his chest. Still asleep, its tiny face serene, innocent of the violence that surrounded its world. Cain was a pathfinder, a man who read terrain and weather like other men read books. His life was a solitary affair of tracking bounties and guiding freight, a quiet penance for a past that was anything but. He hadn't been looking for this trouble. But when he'd seen Corcoran's brand on the horses of the men chasing a lone woman with 2 babies, the past had come roaring back. The debt he owed was to Elara's husband, a man named Marcus, who had died because Cain had hesitated. Marcus had trusted him. Cain wouldn't make that mistake again. He reloaded his Colt, the metallic click of the cylinder turning a small, satisfying sound in the immense, hostile silence. He risked another look. The riders were advancing, moving from cover to cover with military discipline. They were Corcoran's best. It didn't matter. He would get Elara and the children through this, or he would die trying. The plan was simple and insane. He had to lead the riders into the labyrinth of narrow slot canyons to the north, while Elara and the other child used the opportunity to escape east, toward the old mission at Agua Prieta. He'd try to lose them in the maze, then double back and meet her. If he didn't show in 2 days, she was to ride on without him. No one gets left, she'd argued, her voice fierce. If I fall, you ride, he'd countered, his tone leaving no room for debate. The children are the mission. Now, under the cold, indifferent light of the moon, it was time to see the plan through. He took a deep breath, the dust, weight, and recoil of his life settling into a familiar focus. He was ready. Cain broke cover in a calculated, desperate sprint. He fired 2 shots, not aiming to kill, but to draw their full attention. The bullets sparked off the rocks near the lead rider, a deliberate provocation. As predicted, all 3 men turned their fire on him. Lead slammed into the canyon wall around him, the air filled with the angry buzz of hornets. He ignored it, focusing on the path ahead, his mind a cold engine of angles and momentum. He plunged into the narrow mouth of the slot canyon, the walls rising up on either side, swallowing the moonlight and plunging him into a deep, velvety darkness. He didn't slow. He knew this terrain. He had mapped it in his head years ago, a maze of stone and sand that few men dared to enter. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind him, amplified by the close rock walls. The riders were following on foot, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel. They were good, but this was his ground. This was where terrain became a weapon. He ran for what felt like miles, his lungs burning, the rhythm of his own heartbeat, and the soft breathing of the child on his chest the only constants. The canyon twisted and turned, a gut of solid rock. He came to a fork, he remembered, a choice between a wider, easier path and a treacherous, narrow fissure that required a climb. He took the fissure. He wedged his back against one wall and walked his feet up the other, moving upward into the darkness. The infant stirred, a small whimper muffled by the folds of his shirt. "Easy, little one," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. Almost there. He reached a high ledge, 20 feet above the canyon floor, and pulled himself over, collapsing behind a rock outcropping, his body screaming with effort. Below, the footsteps of Corcoran's men slowed, then stopped. They had reached the fork. He heard their voices, low and frustrated, echoing up to him. One of them lit a lantern, its yellow light a fragile, swinging glow in the immense darkness. They were searching for his tracks, but the hard-packed stone floor of the canyon held no prints. He had bought Elara time. Now he had to survive. He checked his gear. 4 rounds left in the Colt, half a canteen of water, a knife, and the child. He tore a strip from his shirt and, with painstaking care, secured the sleeping infant more tightly to his chest, wrapping the cloth under its body and around his torso. The climb out would be dangerous, and he could not afford a single slip. He waited, his breathing evening out, his focus narrowing. The men below were arguing. One wanted to follow the wider path. The other, the leader, was more cautious. Cain recognized his voice. A man named Jarrett, Corcoran's right hand, ruthless, strategic. Jarrett wouldn't give up easily. "He's in here somewhere," Jarrett's voice echoed. "Fan out. He can't hide forever." Cain didn't wait. He began to move, crawling along the ledge toward a series of handholds that led up to the canyon rim. It was a slow, agonizing process. Every scrape of his boot, every dislodged pebble, was a potential death sentence. He moved with the patience of a predator, his body molded to the rock, the child a silent, trusting passenger in the most dangerous journey of its young life. When he finally hauled himself over the rim and onto the flat mesa above, the moon felt like a spotlight. He was exposed. He scrambled for the cover of a cluster of juniper trees, his heart hammering. He had escaped the trap, but the hunt was far from over. Jarrett would not be fooled for long. He would find the path up. The ticking clock had been reset. Elara ran, the second child held tight against her, its small body a solid, reassuring weight. The sounds of the gunfight faded behind her, swallowed by the vast, uncaring desert. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to fight alongside the grim, capable man who had appeared out of nowhere to stand between her and Corcoran's hunters. But she held to the plan, her resolve as hard as the rocky ground beneath her feet. The children were the mission. Her husband, Marcus, had died for them, for the secret they represented. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. She was not a warrior, but Marcus had taught her much. How to read the stars to find east, how to walk without leaving a clear trail, how to husband her resources, her fear, her hope. She moved through the pre-dawn gloom at a steady, ground-eating pace, her eyes scanning for the landmarks Cain had described. A lone mesa shaped like a clenched fist, a dry wash that cut a scar across the plains. The mission at Agua Prieta lay 2 days' journey ahead, a crumbling adobe sanctuary that was their only hope. She had no horse, no food beyond a small pouch of dried meat, and a pistol with 3 rounds left. Her most important asset was the one Corcoran was hunting her for, a set of coated papers, waterproofed and stitched into the lining of her son's swaddling clothes. They were the proof, the leverage, the reason Marcus was dead and Corcoran was relentless. She was the catalyst, the keeper of a truth that could bring Corcoran's entire empire crashing down. But the truth was a heavy burden, and right now her world had shrunk to the next step and the one after that. The sun rose, a merciless white eye in a bleached sky. The heat was a physical blow. She found shelter in the shadow of a rock outcropping, the same kind of terrain that had shielded Cain. She allowed herself a small sip of water, then gave a few drops to the baby, who was beginning to stir and fuss. She unwrapped him, checking the papers, a fear, a constant, cold knot in her stomach. The code was a series of numbers and symbols, meaningless to anyone but the federal marshal in Santa Fe, the man Marcus had been trying to reach. It detailed Corcoran's illegal land grabs, his use of forged Spanish grants to seize territory that belonged to smaller ranchers and the Apache. He was a warlord who used law and rumor as effectively as he used ambush and murder. And the final, damning piece of the puzzle was the identity of his silent partner, a powerful politician whose name, if revealed, would mean ruin. As she rewrapped the child, she thought of Cain. He was a ghost from her husband's past, a man Marcus had spoken of with a mixture of awe and regret. Cain sees the path before it's there, Marcus had told her once, but he walks it alone. Now he was walking it for them. She pushed the worry from her mind, turning it into fuel. She could not afford doubt. She had a promise to keep. She would reach the mission. She would wait 2 days, and if he didn't come, she would ride on. Cain circled back, moving with a wolf's patient stealth. He tracked Jarrett's men from the high ground, a shadow among the rocks. They had found his trail up the cliff face and were now casting about on the mesa, their movements professional and efficient. But they were looking for a man heading east, away from them. They didn't expect the prey to turn and become the hunter. He needed to thin their numbers, to even the odds. He found his spot a narrow defile between 2 large rock formations, the only clear path forward for the trackers. He set his trap. It was simple, a trick he'd learned from the Apache. He used his knife to fray the fibers of a thick length of rope from his pack, then wedged it under a large, precariously balanced boulder at the top of the defile. He ran the other end of the rope down to a small crevice where he could hide. It was crude, but it would work. He waited. The sun beat down on the rocks, the heat a visible shimmer in the air. Finally, he heard them coming. 2 of them entered the defile, Jarrett lagging behind, scanning the ridges. Cain waited until the first 2 men were directly under the boulder. He pulled the rope. The boulder teetered for a heart-stopping second, then crashed down with a sound like thunder, landing exactly where the 2 men had been standing. It was a non-lethal attack, designed to block the path and, more importantly, to sow chaos. Jarrett yelled, his voice a raw curse. He fired his rifle at the spot where the boulder had been, but Cain was already gone, scrambling away through the rocks, the echo of the rockslide his only cover. 1 man was yelling, his leg pinned. The other was trying to help him. Jarrett was shouting orders. Their pursuit was, for the moment, crippled. Cain didn't stop to assess the full damage. He ran, using the confusion to put as much distance as possible between himself and them. He had leveled the playing field. It was now 1 hunter against 1. Jarrett. The thought of facing him sent a cold, familiar thrill through Cain. This was more than just a job now. It was personal. He pushed himself harder, the need to get back to Elara, a fire in his gut. He was rationing his water, taking only small sips, but the child needed more. He found a patch of prickly pear cactus, and using his knife, carefully sliced away the spiny exterior, to get to the moist flesh inside. He squeezed a few precious drops of liquid into the baby's mouth, the infant suckling weakly at his finger. The gear check was grim. He was out of rope. Water was critical. He had 4 rounds, but he was alive, and Elara was for now safe. He found a high point and scanned the horizon to the east. Nothing. Just the vast, empty expanse of the desert. She was out there, alone, pushing on. He had to trust her. He had to trust the plan. He turned his attention back to his own trail, to the lone, relentless hunter who would be following. The game had just begun. They found the burned-out homestead at dusk on the second day. It was a ruin of charred timbers and blackened stone, a monument to some forgotten tragedy. A small, hand-carved marker stood near the collapsed remains of the porch. Here lie the Martins. Taken by cholera. 1872. But the well was still there. As Cain lowered the bucket, the sound of the rope unspooling was deafening in the silence. The water he brought up was cloudy but cool. He had found Elara an hour before, her strength failing, her face etched with exhaustion and dehydration. She had followed his route perfectly. She was a survivor. When she saw him emerge from the rocks, a ghost in the twilight, the relief in her eyes was a physical thing. He took the child from her arms without a word, and she collapsed, her energy completely spent. Now, as the babies drank their fill of the precious water, life began to return to her. The color came back to her face. The hard, desperate look in her eyes softened. "I knew you would come," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I told you I would," he replied, his tone gruff, masking the profound relief he felt. They made a cold camp in the lee of the chimney stack, the only part of the house still standing. There was no wood for a fire, and they wouldn't have risked the light anyway. Jarrett was still out there. Cain knew it with a certainty that went beyond logic. A man like that didn't give up. "We rest here until moonrise," Cain said, checking his pistol. "Then we move. The mission is another 12 hours. Hard travel." Elara nodded, her eyes on the 2 small bundles, sleeping peacefully beside her. She finally opened up, the words spilling out in a torrent of grief and fear. She told him about Marcus, about the papers, about Corcoran's land grabs and the silent partner in Santa Fe. She told him Corcoran believed one of the twins. Her son was his own, from a time before she had fled his obsessive cruelty and found Marcus. Corcoran didn't want an heir. He wanted to erase a mistake, to silence a claim that could complicate his carefully constructed empire. The pieces clicked into place for Cain. This wasn't just about land. It was about legacy and a ruthless man's attempt to control his own narrative. The debt Cain owed to Marcus now felt heavier, more personal. He hadn't just been a friend. He had been a shield for this woman and her children. A shield that had broken. "Marcus was a good man," Cain said, the words feeling inadequate. "He saved my life," she replied simply. "He saved us. Now it's my turn to save his sons." A sudden sound cut through the quiet, the faint, distant whinny of a horse. Cain was on his feet in an instant, his body a coiled spring of tension. He motioned for Elara to stay down, to stay quiet. He crept to the edge of the ruin, using the crumbling stone wall for cover, and peered out into the deepening darkness. A lone rider was approaching, a dark shape moving slowly, deliberately, against the star-dusted horizon. It was Jarrett. He had found them. The sanctuary had become a trap. This was the midpoint, the reversal. They were cornered, exhausted, and their enemy was at the door. Cain looked back at Elara, her face pale in the starlight, her hand resting on the butt of her pistol. Her eyes were wide, but steady. The time for running was over. "Get the children inside the chimney," Cain whispered, his voice a low, urgent command. "Stay there, no matter what you hear." The chimney was a narrow, dark space, but it was made of solid stone. It was the only defensible position. Elara didn't argue. She gathered the sleeping infants and disappeared into the blackness of the hearth. Cain took up a position behind the collapsed wall of the cabin, his Colt steady in his hand. 4 rounds. He made them count in his head. Jarrett was a patient man. He didn't ride straight in. He circled the ruin, his silhouette a moving target against the skyline. He was assessing, looking for signs of life, for the trap he knew must be waiting. The silence stretched, taut and thin. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The only sound was the frantic beating of Cain's own heart. Then a voice cut through the darkness, calm and conversational. "Cain, I know you're in there. Corcoran wants the woman and the boy. The girl you can keep. A fair trade, I'd say." Jarrett's voice was coming from the west, from behind the remnants of the old corral. He was trying to draw him out, to pinpoint his location. Cain remained silent, his eyes scanning the shadows. He wouldn't fall for it. The game of cat and mouse continued for another 10 minutes, a battle of nerves fought in whispers and shadows. Then Jarrett changed tactics. A flicker of movement to the north. A decoy. A rock tossed to draw his fire. Cain didn't bite. He stayed focused on the corral. The real attack would come from there. And then it did. Jarrett burst from behind the corral, not with a rifle, but with a flaming torch. He sprinted toward the ruin, but not toward Cain's position. He ran for the dry, tinder-like remains of the stable. He threw the torch onto the collapsed roof, and the old, dry wood erupted in a whoosh of flame. The fire spread with terrifying speed, casting a brilliant, dancing light across the entire homestead. Their cover of darkness was gone. They were illuminated, exposed. "Now we can see each other," Jarrett's voice called out, this time from a new position. He was smart. He'd used the fire to blind and expose them, and to move undetected. A rifle shot cracked, the bullet thudding into the stone wall, just inches from Cain's head. He fired back, a single instinctive shot, but Jarrett was gone, a ghost in the flickering light. This was a reversal of the cruelest kind. They had found water and a moment of rest, only to be trapped in a circle of fire, hunted by a man who was using the very light they needed to see by as a weapon against them. Cain scrambled back toward the chimney. The fire was spreading, embers carried on the night wind, landing on the dry grass around the ruin. The heat was becoming intense. "We have to move," he said to Elara, his face grim in the orange glow. "The well, it's our only chance." The well was 50 yards away, across open, fire-lit ground. It was a suicide run. But staying meant being burned alive, or picked off by Jarrett at his leisure. Elara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flames. The fear was there, but beneath it was a core of hard, unyielding steel. "The children," she said, her voice tight. "I'll take one," he said. "You take the other. Run straight for the well. Don't look back. I'll be right behind you." He paused, looking at her, at the 2 small, impossibly precious lives in her care. The weight of his promise to Marcus, of his own past failures, settled on him. "By dawn, we'll be safe," he told her, the words a desperate vow, a prayer against the roaring flames and the patient hunter in the dark. He wasn't sure if he was lying, but he said it with all the conviction he could muster. It was all he had left to give. The world became a tunnel of fire and smoke. Cain took one of the infants from Elara, strapping it to his chest in a quick, practiced motion. He drew his Colt. "On my signal," he breathed, his eyes fixed on the open ground between them and the low stone wall of the well. "Wait for his next shot. He'll have to reload. That's our window." They huddled in the suffocating heat of the chimney, the roar of the fire, a constant, deafening thunder. The rifle shot came, a sharp crack distinct from the noise of the flames. The bullet ricocheted off the chimney with a high-pitched scream. "Now!" Cain yelled. They burst from the hearth, running low and fast, the heat a physical blow, the smoke searing their lungs. The ground was lit as bright as day, their shadows dancing grotesquely in the firelight. They were perfect targets. Cain fired his Colt twice toward Jarrett's last known position, not to hit, but to make him keep his head down. 2 rounds left. The well seemed 1,000 miles away. Elara was faster than he expected, her desperation lending her speed. She ran with a survivor's grit, her body shielding the child she carried. They were halfway there when Jarrett fired again. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt just behind Elara's heels. She stumbled, but didn't fall. Cain shoved her forward. Go! They reached the low stone wall of the well and tumbled over it, collapsing into the relative safety of its circular embrace. They were alive for now. Cain peered over the edge. The fire was a roaring inferno, consuming the last of the homestead. Jarrett was somewhere out in the darkness, beyond the ring of light, waiting. The well was a temporary refuge, but it was also a trap. There was no way out. He did a quick gear check. 2 rounds. 1 baby clinging to his chest. Another crying now in Elara's arms. And a well full of dark, cold water. An idea began to form, born of desperation and the unique tactical problems of their situation. The bucket, he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. The rope is still attached. Elara looked at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror as she realized what he was thinking. No, she breathed. It's the only way, he insisted, his gaze hard, resolute. He thinks we're trapped here. He won't be expecting us to go down. The plan was insane. To descend into the blackness of the well, to trust a rotten rope with the weight of their lives, with the lives of the children. It was their only move. The fire was beginning to die down. Soon the darkness would return, and with it, Jarrett would be able to move in for the kill. The ticking clock was the dying of the flames. Give me your son, he said to Elara. I'll go first. When I tug the rope 3 times, you send down the other child in the bucket, then you follow. His voice was calm, tactical, leaving no room for argument. This was the risky plan, the one that narrowed all their options down to a single, terrifying thread of hope. He was a pathfinder, and the only path left was straight down. Cain secured the child to his chest, whispering a few soothing words as he worked. He tested the rope. It was old and frayed, slick with moisture from the well. It groaned under his weight, but it held. He looked at Elara, her face a pale oval in the dying firelight. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she gave a single sharp nod. Trust. It was a heavier burden than the child. He swung his legs over the side and began the descent, his boots finding purchase on the slick, moss-covered stones of the well shaft. The darkness swallowed him whole. The air grew cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and stagnant water. Below him was a black, unknowable void. His world shrank to the feel of the rope in his hands, the strain in his shoulders, and the soft, warm weight on his chest. He moved slowly, deliberately, fighting the urge to rush. A fall would mean death for him and the child. He counted the feet as he descended. 10, 20, 30. His boots finally touched water. It was shockingly cold, rising to his waist. He had made it. He stood on the muddy bottom, the water chilling him to the bone, and looked up. The opening of the well was a perfect circle of starry sky, framed by the last orange glow of the fire. He tugged the rope 3 times, the signal. A moment later, the bucket began its slow, swaying descent. He held his breath. Elara had wrapped the other infant tightly, patting the inside of the bucket with her own shawl. Cain caught it just as it reached the water, lifting the child out. It was crying, a thin, reedy sound that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. He now held both children, one strapped to his chest, the other cradled in his arm. They were alive. They were safe. Now it was Elara's turn. He watched the rope, praying it would hold her weight. He saw her silhouette appear at the top, and then she began her descent. She was slower than he had been, more hesitant, but she was steady. She was halfway down when a new shadow blocked the stars. Jarrett. He was standing at the edge of the well, peering down, a rifle in his hands. Time stopped. Cain's blood ran cold. Jarrett hadn't been fooled. He had waited, patiently, for them to reveal their last desperate move. "Clever, Cain," Jarrett's voice echoed down the shaft, a distorted, mocking sound. "Very clever. Now throw up the boy. And the girl. And I might let the woman live?" Elara froze on the rope, 10 feet above the water. Cain looked up at her, then at the 2 infants in his arms. The mission, his promise, his debt, it had all come down to this. A final confrontation in a cold, dark hole at the bottom of the world. He had 2 rounds left, but Jarrett was at the top, holding all the cards. A direct confrontation was suicide. He needed a different tactic. The terrain. Use the terrain. He looked at the dark water, at the mossy stones, at the rotten rope. His mind raced, searching for an angle, a sliver of a chance, and then he found it. A desperate, impossible gamble. He would have 1 shot, and 1 shot only. "I'm not giving you the children, Jarrett." Cain's voice echoed up the well shaft, steady and cold. "You want them. You come down and get them." It was a bluff, a desperate play for time. He shifted his weight in the chest-deep water, handing one of the infants to Elara as she dropped the last few feet into the water beside him. She took the child, her movements sure despite the trembling of her body. Jarrett laughed, the sound ugly and distorted. "Don't be a fool. I'll just wait you out. You'll freeze or drown, or I can just start shooting. I'm bound to hit something." He was right. They were out of options. Cain looked at Elara. Her face was grim, but her eyes were locked on his, waiting for the signal, for the last desperate play. He pointed upward with his chin, toward a section of the stone wall near the top that was dark with moss and visibly crumbling. He then held up 1 finger. 1 shot. She gave a minute, almost imperceptible nod. She understood. He handed her his Colt. "When he leans over," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crying of the infants. "Aim for the rock, not for him." It was their only chance. A ricochet was unpredictable, but it was better than a straight shot that Jarrett would surely see coming. It was a tactic of chaos, not precision. "Last chance, Cain." Jarrett yelled from above. They saw his silhouette lean forward, his rifle pointing down into the blackness. That was the moment. Elara raised the Colt, her 2-handed grip surprisingly steady. She didn't hesitate. The shot was a deafening roar in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash a brilliant, blinding strobe of light. The bullet struck the crumbling rock face, just as Cain had indicated. It was a perfect shot. The bullet didn't ricochet. Instead, the impact, combined with the percussive force of the gunshot, was enough to shatter the rotten stone. A section of the well wall, a ton of rock and earth, collapsed inward. Jarrett, who had been leaning directly over that section, cried out in surprise and pain as the ground gave way beneath him. He fired his rifle in a convulsive spasm, the shot going wide, and then he was gone. His cry cut short by the sickening thud of his body hitting the water and the cascade of rock that followed. Silence. The echo of the gunshot faded, replaced by the sound of dripping water and the soft whimpering of the children. It was over. Jarrett was a submerged shape in the muddy water, his threat extinguished. They had won, not with brute force, but with a clever, desperate tactic that had turned the very walls of their prison into a weapon. The showdown was over. The cost had been their last bullet, but the outcome was survival. The aftermath was a cold, muddy struggle for life. Cain found Jarrett's body in the murky water, retrieving the man's rifle and a waterproof pouch containing ammunition and matches. Survival first, sentiment later. He ignored the dead man, his focus entirely on the living. Elara was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the violent final act she had been forced to commit. She had taken a life to save her children. Cain saw the shock in her eyes, the tremor in her hands. He took the infant from her, freeing her to cling to the rope for support. "You did what you had to do," he said, his voice low and steady. "You saved us." His words were a simple statement of fact, an absolution she desperately needed to hear. He worked quickly, using Jarrett's rope, which was new and strong, to haul them out of the well. The climb was exhausting, their waterlogged clothes weighing them down. When they finally stood on solid ground again, under the vast, starry sky, the air felt crisp and clean, the breath of a new life. The fire had burned itself out, leaving a field of blackened earth and glowing embers. The world was quiet. They were alone. Cain stripped off his wet duster and wrapped it around Elara and one of the children. He used his own wet shirt to gently clean the grime from the babies' faces. They were cold and miserable, but they were alive. He took a moment to check the papers stitched into the swaddling. They were damp, but intact. The truth, the object of the entire desperate journey, had survived. He built a small, careful fire with the wood from the unburned section of the corral, shielding it with rocks to keep the light contained. They huddled around the small flame, the warmth slowly seeping back into their bones. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, the truth was finally revealed in full. Elara, her voice quiet but steady in the firelight, confessed her deepest secret. Marcus hadn't been the father of her son. Corcoran was. She had been trapped in Corcoran's grasp before she met Marcus, and had fled while pregnant. Marcus had known. He had loved the child as his own, giving both him and his half-sister his name, protecting them with his life. Corcoran's pursuit was not just to silence a claim, but to possess his own bloodline, to control the only thing in the world that he had created but could not own. The debt Cain owed Marcus now seemed impossibly large. The man hadn't just died for his wife. He had died for his wife, his daughter, and the son of his own enemy, all out of love. The costs were tallied in the quiet of the coming dawn. One good man dead, 2 of Corcoran's men fallen in the canyon, 1 dead at the bottom of a well, a homestead destroyed, and a woman who had been forced to kill to protect her family. The price for their safety had been paid in blood. They reached the mission at Agua Prieta late the next day. It was a crumbling sanctuary, its adobe walls the color of the earth, its bell tower silent against the deep blue sky. An old priest, Father Miguel, met them at the gate, his face a roadmap of kindness and sorrow. He asked no questions, simply taking in their ragged appearance, the 2 exhausted infants, and the grim set of Cain's jaw. He led them inside, to a clean, quiet room with 2 simple beds and a small hearth, where a fire already burned. For the first time in days, they were safe. Elara tended to the children, her movements filled with a deep, weary tenderness. Cain stood watch by the window, Jarrett's rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the horizon. The habit of the hunted was hard to break. Father Miguel brought them hot food and cool water. He brought clean, dry clothes for the children. His quiet, unquestioning compassion was a balm on their raw nerves. That night, for the first time, they slept in separate beds, in a room with a solid door and a lock. But the safety felt fragile, temporary. Corcoran was still out there. He had lost his right-hand man, but his reach was long, his resources vast. He would not give up. As Elara slept, her face finally peaceful in the firelight, Cain sat by the window, cleaning the rifle, his mind racing. His duty, his debt to Marcus, was not yet fully paid. Getting them to safety was only the first step. The second was making sure they stayed safe. That meant taking the fight to Corcoran. It meant using the papers not just as a shield, but as a sword. He looked at the sleeping woman and children. He had started this journey as a solitary man, driven by the ghost of a past failure. Along the way, in the fire and the darkness, a bond had been forged. He had become the protector of this small, broken family. He was their shield. The thought did not feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose. He had ridden into this fight alone. He was no longer alone. The land outside the mission was the same harsh, unforgiving landscape. But he was not the same man who had ridden through it a few days ago. He had been transformed by the weight of the children, by the quiet courage of the woman, by the simple, profound act of keeping a promise. He had a new mission now. He would see it through to the end. He would not ride on. He would ride back.